Today on Blue 58, people have questions after the Packers finish up their draft class, and I have answers. Well, sort of.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode. It's Wednesday, and you're getting an episode of Blue 58. You're saying to yourself, this is not correct. We should not be having an episode today. And usually that would be correct, but we got we had extra time this week. So I put out an extra episode and figured we might as well make it a mailbag episode. I know that people have questions after the draft is over, so let's answer a few of them, starting with Janelle in our Discord server. Why did Michael Pratt fall so far? Most boards had him as the 7th overall quarterback, late 3rd to early 4th round pick. Packers got him, of course, much later. There are multiple reasons for this, I think. Some of them are specific to him, which I think are less important, and some are not specific to him, which I think are more important. First, the stuff that doesn't really have anything to do with him but ends up shifting a lot of things around. There was a big consensus quarterback drop-off after the first guy's taken, and this is not really an opinion-based thing. You just look at how the draft played out. Most people didn't think there were any good quarterbacks for a while after the first round, partly because 6 of them went in the first 12 picks. But after Bo Nix goes at 12 to Denver, nobody else took a quarterback until the Saints took Spencer Rattler at 150. It started kind of a little quarterback run, mini run. You had 6 in the top 12 go, and then you had 5 more go in the bottom 107, and then nothing in between those two. I think most importantly, as you look at those quarterbacks that went ahead of Pratt and not in the first round, you see some other kinds of quarterbacks are available, and that's a considerable part of this too. First, you've got Spencer Rattler out of South Carolina. He's been in the quarterback conversation, it feels like, for 8 years now. Was a decorated high school recruit, had an interesting college career, let's put it that way, and now leading up to the draft, there has been some question about where he would go. He ends up going to the Saints. Then you've got Jordan Travis out of Florida State, who's the next quarterback off the board, a dual threat guy prior to his leg injury. We'll see how that shakes out at the next level now that he's recovering from that injury. But he was more decorated by far than Pratt was. He ended up getting Heisman votes in 2023, not inconsiderable there. People gravitate to that sort of thing. Then you've got Joe Milton out of Tennessee, who's a classic kind of measurables guy, 6'5", 235 pounds, and people are going to talk themselves into that. Whether he does or does not have a big arm, people will look at that frame and say, well, big guy's got a big arm. And I guess technically, whether he can throw the ball hard or not, at 6'5", you're probably going to have a large physically arm. So I guess they're not technically incorrect there. Then you've got Devin Leary, the next quarterback off the board out of Kentucky. No real explanation for that one. Had one real good college season, then ended up at Kentucky to finish things out. But then you get to Pratt, and you start to dig into some of the reasons that are specific to him. First, I think you can't discount helmet scouting here. Tulane is not a blue blood program. No matter how well he played there, we talked about him in our day 2 and 3 recap. He played well at Tulane. He set some records as a quarterback there, but nobody really cares about the records you're setting at Tulane, which is just, that's the way things go. You play there, nobody's going to give you the same sort of credit that you get at playing at like a Power 5 school. That's fair and not fair. Then there's the measurables. He's got good but not great size. 6'2", 217 pounds is fine size-wise. You're also not too far from undersized either. And then there's the arm strength knock on him too. Some arm strength stuff I think is kind of voodoo scouting-wise. For a long time, that's something we harped on in this very podcast. The selling point on Jordan Love was his elite, otherworldly arm talent, the Mahomes-like arm talent. Did we see that in the first half of last year? Regardless of how well the rest of the team was playing, did we see the elite, insane arm talent? No, we really didn't. There was a recurring storyline last year about Jordan Love leaving deep balls short each and every week. He couldn't throw a ball that got down the field beyond, 35, 40 yards or so. Even accounting for the variance in arm talent scouting, Pratt's arm is not at that level. There's nobody out there saying these guys got a gun. Like he's seriously, he's got something you're sleeping on. How good he is because of the arm strength there. The more ambiguous arm talent description, there's just not that much stuff there relative to the top end prospects, which is going to always drive you down draft boards a little bit. So some of that stuff is out of his control. He can't get taller. He probably can't add much arm strength, though you could probably fine-tune some things with him that would give him a little bit more velocity. But he can control, how well he plays, and wherever he came from doesn't really matter if he ends up playing really well. And some of the stuff that drove him down those draft boards is even further out of his control. Just what people had in their minds about these other players. I come back to Spencer Rattler. Like, he's just been in the quarterback conversation for so long. If he ends up falling behind guys like Pratt, you would be surprised just because of what he was as a prospect for a long time relative to how good he was even. So I think those are some of the reasons that a guy like Pratt ends up falling. Endlessly Curious asks, do you have any insight on how undrafted free agent signings work? They happen so fast. When can teams approach players? There's the legal answer, and then there's the true answer. The legal answer is that as soon as the draft is done, Mr. Irrelevant comes in, you can start to get to work signing your undrafted free agents. It's a free-for-all as soon as the draft is done. The real answer is that it often starts before then. Teams are putting out feelers. Agents are putting out feelers like, hey, it's the middle of the 6th round here. It looks like my client's not going to get drafted. You can have a spot for us. We're interested in signing with you, because players look at teams the same way that teams look at players. Say you were a 4-year starting, say you're Michael Pratt. Let's just do it this way. Say Michael Pratt doesn't get drafted. He knows, and his agent, more importantly, knows that Brian Gutekunst has been talking this offseason about adding more talent at quarterback. That's something that he wants to do. It's something that he is important to him. He wants to get deeper at quarterback. Well, if Michael Pratt goes undrafted and I'm his agent sitting there at the end of the 6th round, early 7th round, I'm starting to look around the league, and probably before then, at who has drafted quarterbacks, who might have spots available, and be ready to receive calls from those area codes, put it that way, as quickly as I possibly can after the draft. And sometimes you even get other situations where teams and players will sort of be steering this process before the draft is over. Back in the early 2000s, Priest Holmes famously told teams that he did not want to be drafted after he started sliding down the draft board. He said, put the call out there, don't draft me at this point. I will pick where I want to go after the draft. He ends up in Baltimore. I don't know if they actually drafted him or not. He may have ended up being a late-round pick. But the story for a while was that he was telling people that he didn't want to be drafted. And then he ends up having the great career with the Chiefs there, too. Been thinking about him a lot because I've been thinking about Amon Green a lot, actually, lately, for just reasons. And the running back boom of the early 2000s, I think, is going to it will not make sense if you are not a fan of the NFL below a certain age, just how good things were in the early 2000s. Priest Holmes, LaDainian Tomlinson, Amon Green, Marshall Faulk. You can just go on and on and on with some of these great otherworldly backs that were there in the early 2000s, and we just do not have an NFL that's like that anymore. And I think sometimes that's for the worse, but that's a conversation for another day. We're talking about draft questions here. A. Hable asks in our Discord server, maybe somebody already asked about this in here, but I saw the Bears only drafted 5 guys. Nobody else drafted less than 6, and most were at 7+. How much of draft, quote-unquote, winning is volume versus nailing a small amount of picks? Perhaps that's hard to isolate year over year. Actually, I don't think it is that hard to isolate year over year. This is kind of what I was getting at in the pre-draft episode when we talked about the goal is to have good players. No matter what your process is, if you're getting those 3 or 4 solid players every year, you are a successful drafter no matter what route you took to get there. If you draft the guy who maybe was a 3rd-round pick at the end of the 1st round and he turns out to be good, it doesn't really matter where you drafted him because you got the good player. If you just get the guy that falls or whatever, getting the good players is what matters most of all. So you can clown on the Bears a little bit for only picking 5 picks, but if they go 5 for 5 on those 5 picks, they're going to be in good shape. However, it's easiest to nail it when you have more picks. People say the draft is a crapshoot. I think it's more like a roulette table. If we're going to use a gambling specific example here, you're looking at I think there's even, I don't know, I've never been inside a casino. I think there's 30 slots on a roulette wheel. If there's not, it's something like that. But say there is 30. Let's say for sake of example, there's 32 slots in there. And you are betting on those 32 slots where that ball is going to fall, and that's the NFL draft. You got to put your money down on one of those picks, or maybe two or three of them. Your scouting process is going to eliminate, say, 10 to 15 of those picks. You might have 10 or 15 guys out there that you think could be good, but there's going to be a corresponding number that you think we don't want to draft those guys. So you don't put your money down on those. Your draft picks are the remaining guys that you can put money on. You can put money. Would you rather then, if the ball is going to land on one of those guys to be a Hall of Fame player, would you rather have 5 picks or would you rather have 11? You'd rather have 11. We've cited this paper numerous times. I should actually, give you the name of it one of these days. I've linked to it in blog posts before. But a couple economists did a study on success rates in the NFL draft, and they found that teams basically have about a 50-50 shot. When you pick a specific position, you have about a 50-50 shot of the guy you pick being better than the next guy to go at the same position. So if you could be slightly better than 50-50, you're doing a pretty good job. And the only way to really tilt those odds is to make more picks. So the Bears did pretty well for themselves at the top end of their draft. They did what I always love to do playing Madden, starting a franchise. You used to be, I don't know, maybe you still can't, but when I was a kid, I liked to do what they called the fantasy draft. And I would pick all of the worst players in the fantasy draft to start the franchise. You shuffle up the whole NFL, fantasy draft all the worst guys. So you're starting off with a terrible, terrible team, and I wanted to see how quickly I could build a good team. What I like to do is trade picks so I could make sure that I was getting the elite quarterback prospect and the elite wide receiver prospect in the same draft, and you can grow them together. If the Bears did that in this draft, and they did functionally, and they have a good foundation there, they're off to a really good start. They probably nailed 2 of those 5 picks. But it gets a lot easier to nail more than 2 or so when you've got more picks to swing. It's just more chances to win. It's more bets at the roulette table that is the NFL draft. Frozen Cheesemonger has a question that's kind of along those lines, or maybe just dovetails really nicely with what the Bears did here. What are your thoughts on how this draft shakes up the NFC North? The shortest way I could put it would be basically this is going from a rock fight to a Wild West shootout. Think back to where we were a year ago. I think you could pretty confidently say April 30th, 2024, if we're sitting here talking about the state of the NFC North, 3 of those 4 teams aren't entirely sure that they had their long-term guy at quarterback. You're sitting here last year with the Bears starting Justin Fields, the Vikings have Kirk Cousins, and the Packers have Jordan Love. Justin Fields was an open question all of last season. We saw how that ended up playing out. He's no longer a member of the Chicago Bears, if that gives you any indication what the answer was. Same with Kirk Cousins, who tears his Achilles midway through last season. He's no longer a member of the Minnesota Vikings. As good as the ending was for Jordan Love, we hadn't even seen that at this point last year. The Packers hadn't even had a rookie minicamp. We'd not seen OTAs. We did not know what starting quarterback Jordan Love looked like. We had some ideas. It could have been really good, could also have been really bad. And there were times in 2023 when it was both. But I don't think you could say a year ago that the Packers were confident in what they had long-term in Love. But now, Love is established, had a really good second half of the season. The Bears have Caleb Williams, who should be pretty good. You would hope so, at least with the first overall pick, that he's off to a pretty good start. He's the best quarterback prospect the Bears have had in a long, long time. I would say considerably better even than Justin Fields. And the Vikings have J.J. McCarthy. And no matter what you think of J.J. McCarthy, he's probably a better long-term option at this point than Kirk Cousins, especially Kirk Cousins coming off an Achilles injury. Those changes alone represent a pretty significant sea change in the NFC North. Last year, we didn't know if anybody in the NFC North was going to be good. This year, we've got some top-flight talent at quarterback, if nothing else. The landscape is different. The Bears have the best foundation they've had in a while. The Lions have to get used to being winners now. The Vikings are retooling, but they're smart enough that they should never be completely out of this thing. And the big bet for the Packers now is, okay, can you do it again? That is a very, very different landscape than we were a year ago, and I think it's going to be a very interesting division this fall. Old Packers fan throws a bunch of questions about the offensive line our way. Here we go. Another draft with volume offensive line picks. Who do you think will end up as the best 5? Related, does Rasheed Walker or Andre Dillard end up at right tackle or swing tackle, and then Zach Tom moves to right guard? Is Jacob Monk a replacement for Josh Myers in 2025 or a right guard candidate in 2024? When does Royce Newman get cut or traded? I think his contract is not guaranteed, so they could keep him until roster cut down and wait for a market. What do you think their plan is related to Newman? So, in order here, the best 5 question. We're probably looking for the best 5 or best 6 or 7, maybe. Your top 4 right now is probably, in some order, Elton Jenkins, Zach Tom, Jordan Morgan, and Rasheed Walker. After that, it gets a little bit weird. Guard is up in the air. I think Jacob Monk is probably going to get a real shot at guard if nothing changes at center. He could be a center option. Zach Tom could be a center option. So that gets you to 5. Josh Myers probably gets you to 6. He's not great, but still a valuable frame. I think I would probably prefer Josh Myers at guard over, say, like a Royce Newman at guard. The younger guys are going to make things interesting. I think Monk is going to have a lot to say about what happens at both center and guard. But maybe it's time again, and I'll say this again for the Packers, maybe it's time that you start actually seeing what Josh Myers is as a guard, because that's what they've been talking about him as since he arrived in Green Bay. One of their selling points when they drafted him is we think you can play both center and guard. And they've listed him as a combo center guard on their roster page ever since then. We've never really seen him at guard, though, so what is he actually going to be in Green Bay? He's been the starting center for a while. If they have actual competition, what ends up happening? Now, the swing tackle, I think old Packers fan is right here. It's between Rasheed Walker and Andre Dillard. I think they're going to do what they can to get Jordan Morgan on the field as soon as they can. That's where they want him. And they're going to start him out at left tackle, according to Matt LaFleur. I think Walker has the clear inside track there. We do have some evidence of him playing right tackle. Did it a couple of years ago in the preseason. It's not the strongest track record, but he has done it before. And if they want him to really extend his value in Green Bay, I think they're probably going to try him on both sides. The same is going to happen with Jordan Morgan. But I think you're going to have the swing tackle come down to being Rasheed Walker or Andre Dillard. As far as actually making the roster, I would put Dillard pretty firmly behind Walker right now. Is Jacob Monk the Josh Myers replacement? Possibly. No matter what happens with Myers this summer, I think this question reminds us that this is the last year of his contract. So if the Packers are making roster moves, it would make sense that they're starting to look to the future there a little bit. Then what about Royce Newman? When, if ever, do the Packers move on from him? I would think later this summer. The plan is probably that they're going to want to see what they have before they do anything else. They want to see how this offensive line stuff shakes out and what ends up happening with all of these guys up front. Then you move on, get something for Newman if you can. If you can't, well, you give it your level best, just trying to sort things out, giving him more time. Shoot, maybe he comes out and it's really good in training camp. You can't ever discount that happening. It would be strange to see at this point, but can't write it off. Yojo Mojo asks, could you explain what the different techniques are along the defensive line? And to help us better understand it, what are the physical traits and characteristics teams look for at each position? Good question. This is something that I often forget about. Football is stupidly heavy with jargon. We just got so much jargon. It's like every part of every team decided they needed their own specific language to talk about what they do. And to an extent, that's true. But the technique stuff, when you start saying 3 technique or 0 technique or 1 technique or whatever, 5 technique, wide 9, it refers to where defensive linemen line up. That's it. Is where you stand on the football field. Picture yourself standing on the defensive line looking toward the offensive line. The center is 0. If you are directly in front of the center, if you get down in the 3-point stance and your head, your face is looking directly into the face of the center, you are in 0 technique. When you get to either of his shoulders, it's 1 technique. You move out to guard. If you're on the inside shoulder of the guard, you're in 2-eye technique. If you're head up on the center or on the guard, you're in 2 technique. If you're on the outside shoulder of the guard, you're in 3 technique. Then tackle the same thing, 4-eye, 4, and 5. 4-eye is inside the tackle, 4 is head up on the tackle, 5 is outside on the tackle. And then you can go farther, 7, 8, and 9 with tight ends. Wide 9 technique is way outside the tight end. That's your really wide pass rushers in wide 9. But the ones you hear most common are 3 technique and 5 technique. 3 techniques are your penetrating defensive tackles. Think Kenny Clark, how the Packers have played him more the last couple of years. Aaron Donald is a 3 technique defensive tackle. He's trying to get up the field. Most of the time he's lining up either head on or out in the outside shoulder of the guard. 5 technique is your stereotypical 3-4 defensive end from the more old school 3-4 days. The idea is there that they're going to be like the end of the line. your tackle there, your end is going to get on the outside shoulder of the tackle and nothing goes outside him. So the tackle can't push you inside. You're going to stand there and hold the edge so that your outside rushers can go on the outside. Your linebackers behind you can fill either of the spots between guard and tackle and guard and center. And then you can make things work from there. But your idea is going to be to hold the line there. That's why they used to call that, I don't know if they still do, with the way that defensives has changed, but you used to talk about a 5-technique defensive end being like a fence post end. So he's the end of the fence. You stop there at the end, and nothing goes around you to the outside. So that's how techniques work. That's all it's talking about. It's where guys line up on the defensive line. This is just an aside on this question here. This is something that bothers me in football. One of the hallmarks of football is jargon, and one of the hallmarks of presenting yourself as a football knower is using the jargon and then looking down on people who don't understand the jargon, and that bothers me to no end. I really try hard not to do that on this podcast. Sometimes it's hard to not talk in the jargon without explaining it because you don't want to explain it every single time, but if you have questions like this, please ask them. The only way that you don't know what's going on is if you don't ask. And I think there's a culture in football and football media where we don't want to answer these questions that are obvious to you if you know about them, but aren't obvious at all if you don't know what you're asking. So just ask them, and we'll talk about it together, and it's not a big deal. Everybody had to learn from someone. So the people who look down on people for not knowing stuff are morons. They're gatekeeping for no reason. Football shouldn't be like that. Everybody who wants to know about football should be able to learn about football because it's a very knowable sport. It's not that complicated. Once you know the stuff, it's super simple. 3 is it's where you stand. You run plays that are guided by numbers. All the numbers mean something. It's easy to learn once you know what the numbers actually mean. This is a complex sport, but it's not complicated. Put it that way. All the stuff makes it complex. The stuff taken individually is not complicated. You can learn it. I did it. I'm not that smart. It's just a process-oriented thing, and once you learn it, it's easy to remember, especially if you have helpful diagrams and things like that. If it helps you at all, I can hold the diagram up to the microphone, and we can look at it together. Kidding aside there, I could do a better job of publishing blog posts and stuff about what these things mean, but just the jargon doesn't have to be a disqualifying factor. So if there's something you don't know, just ask. We'll talk about it. It doesn't have to be a big deal. Never going to look down on anybody for asking questions because that's how we all learn things. Related to this, a couple different people asked during our mailbag episode prior to the draft, what are the differences between guards and tackles? Like when you talk about a guard prospect versus a tackle prospect, what is the difference there? There are a couple of significant differences, but mainly it comes down to length and athleticism. Length matters a lot on the outside. So you want your tackles taller. You want your tackles to have long enough arms that they can steer people around the edge a lot of the time. They have to move in space a lot, so that length really matters. That's why you see a lot more 6'8" tackles like Joe Alt, and you don't see many 6'8" guards because it just doesn't work geometry-wise. The angles don't work to be that tall on the inside because the inside is all about leverage and like short area strength, about moving guys in a small restricted area. Sometimes they talk about centers and guards as being like in the phone booth, for those of you who are old enough to remember what that is. But you're just standing there and you're blocking in confined space because you've got an alignment on either side of you. So you want guys that are built more like fire hydrants. They're short and they're squatty and generally a little bit thicker than your outside guys. And then athleticism, there's a little bit of a difference too. Both guards and centers and tackles have to move, so you have to have some baseline athleticism no matter where you're playing on the offensive line. But the athleticism matters more on tackle because they have to move both side to side and up and down the field. Think about David Bakhtiari. Picture him in your mind dropping back on a pass snap or a pass blocking rep. He's doing his enormous kick steps, a very kind of unorthodox movement. But you have to be a very athletic person to be able to get the depth that you need to be able to prevent these ultra-speedy, bendy edge rushers from coming around the outside. Think about prime Clay Matthews, about how low he would get to the ground coming around the outside. You have to get back as a tackle very quickly and efficiently to counteract those sorts of things. Otherwise, somebody like Matthews is just going to slither around the edge and get to your quarterback. You also have to be able to move and have enough strength as you move to be able to set up and be strong and anchor against a bull rush. So it's a lot of different athleticism, and you need more of it on the outside than you do inside. Serb Packer asks, is it possible to make an assessment of which players are possibly starters, which drafted players, who's a possible starter during the season, who's a project for next season? I know it's possible that starters to get hurt, but you never know what happens over the course of the season. Real quick, and we'll do a little bit more on this later this week. We're going to do a roster projection when we get around to it, but it'll be the Thursday episode this week. But we'll do a whole roster projection of who makes it, who doesn't. But in terms of this year's draft class, I think there are three obvious starters in this class. Jordan Morgan, Edgerrin Cooper, and Javon Bullard all should be either pushing for starting spots or starting basically right away. The backups in this class look like Marshawn Lloyd. I think that one's obvious. Teron Hopper is going to be a special teamer. Jacob Monk could push for starting reps right away, but I would guess he's probably a backup at all three interior spots to start. Evan Williams will get on the field a lot, but he's not going to be a starter. And Kitano Oladapo, probably the same thing. Kalen King, probably the same thing, a backup at best. Then you've got a couple guys who I think are headed for the practice squad or maybe off the team entirely in Michael Pratt and Travis Glover. It's not that complicated. I think you just look at the geography of the roster, how it's shaping up right now. That's where the weak spots are: linebacker, offensive line, safety. Those are going to be the guys that play, and those three guys off the board right away are going to get the most reps out of the gate. Craig H. asks a medical question. Regarding Packers draft pick Jacob Monk, I was hoping you could talk about the odd cold water allergy he supposedly has. Do you have any additional information regarding this? Could he potentially have an outbreak during a game in December or January in Green Bay? So here's the story that brought this up. He said that he had some kind of reaction prior to a game at Duke. He got in the cold tub and he got out because he got itchy, got hives. He said in a story that Rob Domowski wrote this week, quote, "I got in the cold tub and found out I was allergic to water. Not allergic to water, allergic to cold water. I ended up getting some hives before the game, before we flew out. Yeah, that was something to learn, I guess," end quote. He doesn't think this is a long-term problem. This is something the Packers apparently knew about and were not concerned about. But he doesn't think it's going to be a long-term issue. Quote, "I can be in snow and all that. It's always been a dream of mine to play in the snow. I'm not afraid of the cold. I'm not afraid of cold water. I think it's just a one-time thing, honestly." Well, not a one-time thing, clearly, but I feel like the temperature has to be just right for me to sit there for that long. But I'm not worried about being in cold water at all, honestly, end quote. So this is actually a not common but well-documented condition called cold urticaria. I had learned about this a little bit today. According to the Cleveland Clinic, cold urticaria is a condition that causes an allergic reaction to cold temperatures. A person with cold urticaria may develop a rash or hives after eating or drinking something cold, putting ice on their skin, swimming or bathing in cold water. There you have the cold tub example, or walking outdoors in cold weather. This also, basically what's happening here is your body is straight up having an allergic reaction to the cold water. The Cleveland Clinic says your body actually releases histamines like an allergic reaction. Those are the things that your body makes to fight off irritants that get into your system. Like in my case, I have really bad pollen allergies. I take an allergy medicine year-round, a couple of different kinds actually, just because it's so bad. Everything sets me off, pollen or dust, or sometimes the sun, just start sneezing for no reason. But nobody knows why this happens. It can be a symptom of other disorders. It's something you can inherit genetically. That's called familial cold urticaria. But you treat it the same way you treat other common allergies. You take an antihistamine and basically just hope for the best and just be conscious of the things that trigger it and try to avoid putting yourself in those situations. I suppose it could happen in the cold weather. I'm not a doctor, so don't take my advice, Jacob Monk. But I think if you take the proper precautions, you will probably be okay in those situations. Just pop an allergy pill and you're good to go. FMP 330 asks, can we consider Aaron Hill, the new strength and conditioning coach, a factor in this year's draft? We all know that players like Christian Watson and Eric Stokes, to name those two, have really high ceilings but are kind of plagued by the injury bug. My point is that the team has the players, but not the playing time from those players, and sometimes repairing is much better than replacing. And, well, you don't have to end the quote. That's just the question. So I think the thinking pre-draft here, and this is something that I brought up a couple times, is that the Packers would be at least interested in a pass catcher and a cornerback because they didn't know what they had in Watson and Stokes. But the Packers seem very confident in both Watson and Stokes. I don't know if you would call it recovery. Put it this way, their situation after speaking with a hamstring specialist this offseason. They seem very comfortable with those guys. They seem like they're in good shape now and ready to go. So it doesn't seem like the Packers are super worried about where they're at, which, following the line of thinking from the questioner here, and I think it's a good one, the Packers didn't go with a wide receiver or a cornerback. I don't think that's so much about Aaron Hill, but probably more about the hamstring treatment. But I think the overall point here is good. If the Packers feel good about Watson, if they feel good about Stokes and feel like they can give them, quality full seasons at close to 100%, that does change what those rooms look like. If Watson isn't an injury question mark this season, if Stokes isn't an injury question this season, you've got a lot more depth in both of those rooms. If Stokes is like he was as a rookie, this is 3 years ago now, so you never know. But if he's like he was in 2021, the Packers really could have something there with him kind of holding down that spot on the outside opposite Jair Alexander. Or even if he's able to give you more quality reps than he could last year, that helps guys like Carrington Valentine and Corey Ballantyne a lot just because they don't have to be in the spotlight as much. If you've got three guys who can rotate opposite Jair Alexander, the situation changes a lot at defensive back and gives you a lot more options. So even if it's not Aaron Hill, the overall health picture here is an important one to consider. Finally, Endlessly Curious sends us out with this one. Do you recall your episode near the middle of last season when you kind of mock meeting everyone trying to save their job when Jordan Love looked like a flop? Do you think there's any chance the second half of the season was a fluke, that it was just a team getting hot, playing far above their true level? Just to be clear, I don't think that, but crazier things have happened. That was a fun episode. I do remember that one. And we did do the disclaimer up at the front of this episode. I didn't think anybody was going to get fired. I even went so far as to say I thought Joe Barry was going to be back for this season. Jeff Hafley is still essentially a complete unknown. We get a pretty good vibe check from him, but I still feel better with him as the defensive coordinator than I think I would right now with Joe Barry heading into the next season. Now, could last season have been a fluke? I think the intellectually honest answer is yes. You have to say that there's a possibility that was a fluke. And even just beyond hedging your bets by saying it's possible it could have been a fluke, there's good evidence for guys that are not as good as Jordan Love is or appears to be having streaks like that. We talked about Baker Mayfield last year having a hot stretch during his first year as a starter. We talked about Jared Goff doing the same thing. I think Daniel Jones had a similar streak over like 4 games or so, maybe even longer at 5 games. But Jordan Love put together a pretty significant 8-game stretch there. So it seems like this probably isn't a fluke. But if I were Brian Gutekunst, this would be the nagging question that pops into my head as I'm drifting off to sleep at night and causes me to, have to get up and go get a drink of water or walk around for a little bit. We gotta sit and think about this for a second, because the Packers are about to make a really big decision on Jordan Love here. The deadline, not the deadline, but the window for adding a new contract or extending his contract here opens up by the end of this week. May 2nd is the day when they can sign Jordan Love to a new contract, because it'll have been a year since his last contract was signed. But whether or not it was a fluke would bother me forever. And it would bother me until he's probably got 2 or 3 solid starting seasons under his belt. Just the chance that at any time this could still go sideways, because you've got to commit to him here in the relatively near future, and it's going to be a big financial commitment. And this is the problem with drafting him where they drafted him. And when they drafted him at the end of 2020, and I'm going to talk more about Jordan Love at some point, either this week or next, about revisiting the conversation back from 2020. But the point we made on draft night back then was the window for success narrows, the path for success narrows because of when you have to draft him there. if he ends up being good, it doesn't really matter. But it just makes the margin for error slimmer because you get less time to evaluate him before he ends up being needing to have this big contract extension. You pay him starting quarterback money, which is going to be expensive. You're going to look for it's going to be in the neighborhood of $40 million per year. That's just how it is. That's what a starting quarterback costs, and having a good one is worth paying that. So, all that to say, this is the question that would bother me. Was it a fluke? I don't think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that it was a fluke. The only real evidence to suggest that was just that there have been teams that have gotten hot before. However, I think what gives me a lot of encouragement against that idea is how it all happened at once. It wasn't Jordan Love just catching fire like we see quarterbacks do sometimes. It wasn't late 2016 Aaron Rodgers level stuff from Love. It wasn't like he was going above and beyond play structure, just making stuff happen, making insane throws play after play after play just to keep the Packers in games. It wasn't Jordan Love single-handedly winning the gunfight at the OK Corral by himself every week. It was a bunch of guys kind of gelling together and playing to their potential. It was Jaden Reed being a consistent contributor. It was Dontavian Wicks getting more playing time. It was Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft kind of ascending at the same time, and then Kraft really, really taking off when he had to play even more after Musgrave ruptured his spleen. It was Romeo Doubs finding a role that fit him. It was Christian Watson finding ways to be a contributor without being like the sole guy who had to carry the offense, which I think is another aspect we have to talk about just with him, just questions of expectations and stuff like that. It was all of those things happening together, along with the defense playing together better than they had before, that worked together to fuel this Packers run. I think we need to be careful about expectations when we talk about this stuff, because even if the Packers are better than they were on balance over the course of last season, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be Packers versus Dallas in the playoffs all through the 2024 season. I don't think we should expect them to play at this level. However, I think we did see real stuff from the Packers down the stretch. I'm not worried about it being a fluke. If my job was on the line about whether or not it was a fluke, that is the sort of thing that would keep me up at nights, but ultimately it's something that you don't have control over, and you can just put the best guys around him that you can and hope for the best from there. And that's really what it's going to come down to for the Packers, just hoping for the best and seeing what you get. But that's all that really can be said for any of us. We do the best that we can to prepare and hope for the best and see how things work out. If they do, yay for us. If they don't, we'll try again next time. That's a good note to end on for this podcast. If we did well, great. If we don't, well, we'll try to do better next time. That's all I've got for you in this episode. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. That's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation that you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.